Last thing I'll ask you, when you look at the roster from where it was a year ago to where it sits right now, how dramatic is the improvement, and what do you think going forward? Who deserves the credit for that?
It's funny for all the turnover and all the regime changes. This roster is kind of built over, you had the Sashi Brown regime that obviously was controversial, but if nothing else, they went out and acquired a bunch of draft assets, handed them over to John Dorsey. John Dorsey didn't do everything right, but he added talent as well. A lot of the guys we talked about today came in through John Dorsey using Sashi Brown's draft picks. And then Andrew Berry is kind of fine tuning this roster a little bit. So, as crazy as it's been kind of going back to 2016, you can kind of look at all this stuff and see that, from Sashi Brown collecting those draft assets to John Dorsey using them to Andrew Berry finishing the roster. I don't know if one specific guy actually gets credit for this. I think it's just been across the board, adding talent, finally finding the right guy to coach this football team. And now the job gets really hard because now you've got to finish this roster and now you've got to take it to that level where it can, like I've said a couple times, win the North and potentially win a Super Bowl.
I lied. I got a couple more. So,
That's fine.
so,
I've got no place to be.
so when you look at Andrew Berry, I think it's even more impressive because he didn't feel like he had to, rip everything out that wasn't his. He kind of tweaked it, and I think that speaks volumes because that's the task at hand. It's not like you have to pull the engine out of this. You got to throw some tires on it, find something in the middle of the thing that'll make it work defensively, and tweak it more.
And that's sort of one of the things we haven't talked about a lot. But this coaching staff and this front office, like you said, they didn't look at this roster and say, well, that's not my guy, and that's not my guy. Obviously, you're not going to say that with a guy like Myles Garrett, and you're not going to say that with a guy like Denzel Ward or even a Jarvis Landry, Odell Beckham. I mean, those guys are uber talented players. But even some of the smaller pieces that we always see turnover, we didn't see any of that. Well, that's not my guy, so I don't want him. Whoever's in that building, they work with, they develop, they coach up. And that's really kind of why this has worked. So whether it's a guy that Sashi picked or Dorsey picked or Andrew Berry picked, the job is the same. If that guy's in the building, develop him, coach him up, get him to a point where he can help you win football games.
We hear the dog pound barking behind you, so that's always a good sign. Last thing, promise this time. We haven't heard much from Jimmy and Dee Haslam. I think that's a sign that they finally feel comfortable that they got that right in that building.
Yeah, and I think the more important thing is we haven't heard people calling to hear from them. I think every year, right around the middle of the season, it's like, why haven't we heard from ownership yet? I don't think people want to hear from ownership right now. I think the Haslams have done a really good job, and they admitted back in training camp that they didn't feel the organization managed expectations well in 2019, and they've done a good job of staying kind of in the background. J.W. Johnson will tweet every now and again, but it's nothing out of the ordinary. They've just let this thing play out, and I think they sort of like the whole organization felt burnt by what happened in 2019 and understood you've just got to let this thing work. You've got to let it play out, and there's no point in taking victory laps before you've done anything. And I really think that's been the approach this year.